Today we talk about 1775 by Academy Games. This game is the sequel of a previous game by Academy called 1812. Well, it is the sequel mechanically because this is the second game based on the same system. Of course, it is a prequel, historically speaking, because this is a game about the American Revolution. Considering that I'm filming this on July 3rd, and most likely I will release my video on July 4th, I think it is particularly appropriate to talk about this game, and definitely playing this game in the last couple of days has put me in the right mood for the celebrations to come. 2 to 4 players, war game slash Euro game. There are wooden cubes, the game is very light, but at the same time it has a war game theme. It looks a little bit like a hybrid, I believe, between a Euro game and a war game. The good thing, of course, is that you can use that to lure your Euro gaming friends into playing a war game with you. 1775. Let's take a closer look at it. This is the map of the game. It is a beautiful mounted map, really nice colors, really nice palette. It depicts the original colonies with also some other areas such as Quebec, Nova Scotia. What you see here is the game after I just played a solitaire game. The game plays reasonably well as a solitaire game. I was pleasantly surprised. I was definitely able to play a game in that mode and enjoy it. The game portrays the two sides involved in the war, the British side and the American side. Each side is divided in two main factions. The British are divided in British regulars and militia and loyalist militia, and the Americans in Continental Army and Patriot militia. Each faction of the sides has a deck of cards which is unique to that side. Each faction is represented on the board by cubes of a certain color. The cubes represent troops: light blue for the Continental Army, white for the Patriot militia, yellow for the Loyalist militia, and red for the British regulars. There are also some allies that may or may not play a role in the game. There are Native American units that are green and they start the game in that area and may be recruited by the players to help them in the fight. There may be French units that may join the American cause, and the French units are purple, or German mercenaries that are represented by orange cubes. And these factions, the French and the German, may enter the game through card effects. Also, each faction comes with a specific set of dice, and not all dice are born equal in this game. Dice for different factions have different combinations of symbols of them to represent the way in which different types of units behaved during the conflict, which is one of the things that I already liked the most in the previous game in the system, 1812, and it is one of the things that I like the most here again, because you really do not have to worry about making your units work the way they did historically. You move them, you start a combat, you roll the dice, and your units will behave that way. From loyalist militia that will flee the battlefield quite easily, to British regulars that will stay and fight or die. Well, sometimes they retreat, but at least they don't flee the battlefield. In any case, I like the variety of effects that the dice bring into the game without bringing any extra complexity. You roll the dice and that happens. And the effects happen. Also, it is just fun to roll big bunches of colorful, beautiful dice. Each faction is also represented by an initiative cube. The 4 initiative cubes are placed in this pouch here at the beginning of each round, and then they are drawn from the back randomly so that the activation of the units of the factions will proceed in random order. You will first resolve the activation of the active faction, then you will draw another cube and resolve that activation. Uncertainty there. which is one of the factors that actually makes the game solitaire friendly. The game accommodates between 2 and 4 players, but you always have the 4 main factions in play. So if you have less than 4 players, that means that some players will have to deal with 2 hands of cards and with 2 factions on the same side. It is the sides that lose or win the conflict, not the factions by themselves, which of course makes quite sense. And I don't know if you can see it from there, better if we zoom in a little bit. The map is divided in colonies, and colonies are divided in areas. Some colonies may just be one area, like Delaware. Other colonies may be much larger and divided in several areas. Control of colonies is pretty important, among other things, to win the game. You win the game by controlling more colonies than the opponent at the end of the game, and if there is a tie there, actually the game ends in a draw. And in historical terms, what the rulebook says is that that means that the United States become a province of French Canada. Ah la la, c'est la folie. Anyways, to control colonies, you need to be the only player that has units in that area. There may be allied units with you, for example, French units with the Americans, or Native American units with whichever faction has they are working for or they're working with. But the idea is that, for example, in this case, we only have Patriot Militia and Continental Army units. Then Pennsylvania is controlled by the Americans. If that British cube somehow made it there, that would be all that it takes to remove control and to make that colony neutral. Sometimes it is not that hard to say win a battle, but it may still be hard to retain control of a colony and to prevent an opponent from retaking control of a colony, because if you want to control all of the areas or to create a good and reliable line of defense, you're stretching your forces into smaller groups that can be easily defeated by the opponent during a counterattack. So factions are activated by drawing activation cubes from the pouch. Then the player that controls the active faction will play a card from his hand. The players have hands of 3 cards from their deck, and cards may be movement cards or events. If you play an event, well, it is self-explanatory. You simply resolve the effect described on the event card. Movement cards, there are 2 types of such cards. One is for land movement, and that indicates the number of armies that you can move by playing this card, 2 armies, and the number of areas by which each army can move. 2 armies by up to 3 areas. Warship movement, in this case, that means 1 army can move through a body of water to an area that is adjacent to that same body of water. So that the player plays a card and then can move the corresponding number of armies. An army in this game is any group of units that are in an area that contain at least 1 block of the activated faction, and that the owning player decides to move as a single entity. You can move up to the movement allowance given to you by the card. You have to end movement when you enter an area containing enemy units, and you cannot pick up or drop off units as you go. After all movement has been resolved, if some of your units reached areas that contain Native American units that are still neutral, then you can recruit them, you attach them to your army. If after movement there are units from both sides in the same area, then in that area you have to resolve combat. You will resolve combat in all such areas on the board. Suppose that we have these French-American units entering this area here and the movement there, then we're going to resolve combat. In combat, the defender always fires first by rolling dice. The effects of those dice are resolved, then the attacker gets to roll, and the players alternate like this, back and forth, until there are only blocks of one of the 2 sides present in the area where the battle started. To resolve combat, You roll cubes for all factions involved, up to the number of cubes that a faction has. There is a limit that is given by, well, the number of dice that you have. For example, the British, the Loyalist Militia has 3 dice. I have 4 blocks there, but I still only get to roll 3 dice. The British Regulars have 2 dice, and I can roll both. Native Americans have 2 dice, but I only have 1 die there, so I only take a green die. Then, well, you roll the dice. And you apply the result. Suppose there is a blank, so that you see what blanks do. Each flea result indicates a cube of that color, in that case a yellow color, that leaves the area of the battle and is placed in a special box for fled units. Fled units will be brought back in the next time that faction activates, together with reinforcements. Actually, each time that a faction is activated will receive 4 cubes as reinforcements and fled units that come back to the fight from the previous battles. And you can add such reinforcements in cities that are in colonies that you control. That is for fled units. For each unit that rolled a target symbol, the opponent must eliminate a block. The blank results give the owning player a choice. The owning player can choose to treat that as no effect, nothing happens, or the owning player can choose to retreat a cube of the corresponding color from the battle. So here we have 3 hits that the American attackers need to suffer. Then let's say that we remove these blocks here. And now the Americans get to roll with the dice corresponding to the cubes that they still have in the battle. Not such a great result. 1 hit applied to the British defenders, and let's say that the British choose one of their loyalist blocks. Then we remove a block from there. And then we have 3 blank results, and let's say that the Americans see that this is not going very well, and they decide to use these blank results to retreat from the battle. Now, the British roll again. It is unlikely that that block will make it until next turn. Sorry, back and forth until all blocks, all cubes of one of the 2 sides are removed from the area of the battle. I like this game very much. I like the way it looks. It is a beautiful game. I like the same things that I liked in 1812 already. That is the simplicity in which the theme comes alive through the mechanics, through cards, through die rolls. Here there are a lot of pretty cool cards that will allow you to set up some nasty traps for your opponent if you use them at the right time. The use of the allies here also is particularly interesting because it adds a dimension to the game. Being able to recruit native units is another plus because of course it is a good resource that you can have, but it's a limited resource and it will cost you activations to go and recruit enough native units to make a difference. And well, there are just many ways in which the game balances itself out. Say you had a pretty crippling defeat, a lot of your units fled the battlefield. Well, next time you will be able to bring a lot of those back and you can start pushing back. Of course, the temptation initially is to simply put everybody back in one location to create a monster army that nobody can defeat. But here you win through control of colonies, through control of multiple locations. And that means that your huge army can destroy anything that encounters along the way, but may not be able to go far enough and to occupy enough territories to actually be able to win the game for you. Actually, there's something important here, which is you need to find a balance between the power of impact to attack your enemy frontally, at the same time the ability of dispersing units to occupy territories quickly, not necessarily because that will give you control of a colony, but because it will deny control of a colony to the enemy. And sometimes just a single unit well placed in a territory, in a large colony, is enough to deny control of the colony to the opponent. As a matter of fact, yes, the American side has a territorial advantage, which is it is pretty easy to take control of Massachusetts. You do not start with Massachusetts, but you'll get it as the American player. And then your colonies are there, close to one another, and they're very small, and that means that they're easy to defend. Whereas between Nova Scotia and Quebec, the British player has some large areas to cover, and it is not that hard for the American player to infiltrate some units there and to block reinforcements that may come from that side. It is quite easy for the British player to lose momentum if the British player doesn't inflict some powerful damage early in the game. Actually, I noticed this, that indeed the British player seems to have a hard time to win the game unless he wins earlier in the game. One factor that I have a little bit of mixed feelings about, and some of the people I played the game with share my feelings, is that luck can really have a huge factor. There are going to be some huge swings of luck, or at least there can be. And not so much for the die rolling, because you roll dice so many times in every battle that things tend to even themselves out in the long run. The point here is about the activation, the order of the activations, which is so important. And if you get 2 activations, you will gain a good advantage. Then the opponent will get 2 activations in a row, back to back, and the opponent can regain territory. Yet sometimes if you get more than 1 activation in a row and you have a good hand of cards, you may be able to take control of a lot of lands, to prevent enemy reinforcements from coming back effectively. That means that even if later the opponent has several activations in a row, it doesn't matter that much because the opponent doesn't have much to do with those. This is something that we have seen happening. We have had a game in which the British managed to activate 4 times in a row, and trust me, the game was over probably by the end of the 3rd activation. The 4th were just, I don't know, for the fun of it. But that is what happened. There may be ways of mitigating that, but I guess that there will be occasionally some game that will be thrown out of balance, mainly because of the activation, of the order of activations. You can try to figure out ways of mitigating this if that bothers you. For example, something we considered doing was, well, the first cube in a round is drawn randomly, then you have to draw one of the 2 cubes of the other faction, so that within a round you still alternate factions, even though you don't know exactly the order in which they will activate. Just an hypothesis, but as is, the game is a fun one. It is fun and full of tension because you rarely will be able to do all that you want to do, to defend all that you want to defend, to create a powerful position where you do not have to worry about counterattacks. The possibility of comebacks are considerable, but the point, the entire game is that there will be a time in which the tide turns one way or the other. Comebacks become more and more complicated. And in that case, if the choose cards do not show up, we found more merciful if one of the choose sides simply concedes. Because after the tide turns, if the losing side really decides to be stubborn, the losing side can delay the game a lot, even though the game may not necessarily turn in favor of the player that is just clinging to some lost hope. Anyways, 1775. The theme is fun, the implementation is fun, the game is accessible and looks very good. It is overall a very good game, and definitely I had fun playing it. It plays much faster than 1812. This is something very important, and the action starts immediately because the 2 sides just have territories that are adjacent to one another. There are just small islands of units of the 2 players on the side. You're immediately thrown into the action. So fun game. If the luck factor bothers you, you may have a problem with this game at times, but overall this is a game that I like, and actually I like quite a bit.